What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses goes head-to-head with late-night television's most provocative host? You won't believe what unfolds when Natalie Portman sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find herself trapped in a verbal battleground that would leave audiences stunned and social media ablaze. The tension that erupted last night between Portman and Stephen Colbert wasn't just uncomfortable television. It was a complete meltdown that ended with one of the most dramatic walkouts in late-night history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in ways that nobody saw coming. The evening started like any other taping of The Late Show. Natalie Portman arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theater looking elegant and composed, prepared to discuss her latest directorial project, a deeply personal film exploring women's experiences in conflict zones. The actress, known for her thoughtful approach to both her craft and activism, had specifically requested that the conversation focus on the humanitarian aspects of her work, rather than tabloid gossip or personal controversies. But Stephen Colbert had other plans entirely. From the moment the cameras began rolling, something felt different in the studio. Colbert's usual warm-up banter with the audience carried an edge that seasoned crew members hadn't heard before. His jokes landed harder, his timing more aggressive, and when he introduced Portman, there was a barely concealed smirk that suggested he was planning something his guest wasn't expecting. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredibly talented Natalie Portman," Colbert announced, his voice carrying that familiar theatrical flourish. But as Portman made her way to the guest chair, exchanging pleasantries and settling in with her characteristic grace, those watching closely could see Colbert's eyes already calculating his next move. The first few minutes proceeded normally. Enough. Colbert asked about her new film, and Portman eloquently described the research process, the interviews with refugee women, and the importance of amplifying voices that often go unheard. Her passion was evident, her intelligence undeniable, and the audience responded warmly to her sincerity. But then Colbert made his first strategic pivot. "Now, Natalie, you've always been very vocal about social causes," he began, his tone shifting subtly from conversational to interrogative. "Some might say you use your platform quite extensively to share your political views. Do you ever worry that audiences just want to be entertained rather than lectured?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Portman's smile faltered, for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to viewers at home, but glaringly obvious to everyone in the studio. She recovered quickly, but the damage was done. The gauntlet had been thrown. "I think artists have always had a responsibility to reflect the world around them," Portman replied carefully, her voice maintaining its measured tone despite the obvious provocation. "Entertainment and enlightenment aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, the best art has always done both." Colbert leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "But isn't there something a bit privileged about a Harvard graduate who's made millions in Hollywood telling working-class Americans how they should think about complex global issues?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful sparring that Colbert was known for. This felt personal, targeted, and unnecessarily cruel. Portman's composure remained intact, but those watching could see her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "I think having an education and a platform creates an obligation to use both responsibly," she responded, her voice growing cooler. "And I'd argue that dismissing someone's perspective based on their background rather than engaging with their ideas is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps us from having meaningful conversations about important issues." The first crack had appeared in what should have been a standard promotional interview, and everyone in the room could feel the atmosphere shifting from friendly chat to something far more volatile. What came next would push both host and guest into territory neither had anticipated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would dominate headlines and change how people viewed both of these public figures forever. Colbert wasn't finished. If anything, Portman's articulate pushback seemed to fuel his determination to break through her composure. He shuffled his note cards with theatrical deliberation, his next question already loaded and aimed directly at her most vulnerable point. Speaking of meaningful conversations, Colbert continued, his voice taking on that mock-serious tone that his longtime viewers knew meant trouble was coming. Let's talk about your recent comments regarding the situation in the Middle East. You've been quite outspoken about Israeli policies, which is interesting considering your own background. Some critics have suggested that your stance is, shall we say, conveniently distant from your heritage when it suits your Hollywood image. The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Portman's face went completely still, her eyes narrowing as she processed what had just happened. Colbert had crossed, a line that experienced interviewers knew never to cross. He had made it personal, attacking not just her opinions but her identity and authenticity. "I'm sorry, what exactly are you implying?" Portman's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if she had shouted. The transformation was startling. The composed actress was gone, replaced by someone who clearly felt cornered and was preparing to fight back. Colbert, either oblivious to the danger or deliberately pushing toward it, pressed forward with a smile that looked increasingly predatory. "I'm not implying anything, Natalie. I'm asking directly. Don't you think it's a bit rich for someone who's built a career partly on her Jewish identity when it benefits her? Think about your roles, your public persona. To then turn around and criticize Israel so harshly? It seems like having your cake and eating it too." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Portman sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, her breathing controlled but visibly shallow. The audience was so quiet that the hum of the studio lights became audible. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. That is an incredibly offensive and reductive way to characterize both my career and my beliefs, Portman finally responded, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained fury. "My identity isn't a costume I put on and take off for convenience. And my criticism of certain policies comes from the same place as my pride in my heritage, a belief in justice and human dignity." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, her obvious anger seemed to embolden him further. "But isn't that exactly what Hollywood activism is? Picking and choosing which parts of your background to emphasize based on what's trending? Your film tonight is about women in conflict zones, but you've been conspicuously quiet about women's rights in certain Middle Eastern countries. Why is that, do you think?" The attack was so blatantly unfair and loaded with false premises that even some of Colbert's own staff were exchanging uncomfortable glances. This wasn't comedy or even legitimate political discourse. This was a hit job, delivered with the veneer of late-night entertainment, but designed to humiliate and provoke. Portman's composure finally cracked visibly. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made several audience members lean back instinctively. "Are you seriously questioning my commitment to women's rights while ambushing me with prepared talking points designed to paint me as some kind of hypocrite? This is exactly the kind of bad faith questioning that makes meaningful dialogue impossible." "I'm just asking the questions that people at home are thinking," Colbert replied with feigned innocence, but his smile had become genuinely cruel now. "Isn't that what good journalism is about? Holding public figures accountable for their contradictions?" "This isn't journalism," Portman shot back, her voice rising for the first time. "This is a gotcha ambush dressed up as an interview. You invited me here under false pretenses, and now you're trying to score cheap points by distorting my positions and questioning my authenticity. Is this really what your show has become?" The tension in the room was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Colbert's band members looked like they wished they could disappear, while the studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing brilliant confrontational television or a complete professional meltdown. What nobody in that room realized was that this was only the beginning. The real explosion was still to come. Colbert seemed to sense he had wounded his target, and like a predator detecting blood in the water, he moved in for what he clearly intended to be the killing blow. His demeanor shifted from mock casual to openly aggressive, abandoning any pretense that this was still entertainment. "You know what, Natalie? Let me be completely honest with you and the audience," Colbert said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that his critics knew all too well. "I think what we're seeing here is exactly what's wrong with celebrity activism today. You come on my show expecting to be treated with kid gloves, to promote your little passion project without any real scrutiny, and the moment someone asks you to defend your contradictory positions, you fall apart and cry foul." The audience gasped audibly. Several people could be heard shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and at least one person near the front appeared to be shaking their head in disbelief. This had gone so far beyond the bounds of acceptable television behavior that even Colbert's most loyal fans were struggling to process what they were witnessing. Portman stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly cavernous studio. "I am not going to sit here and be lectured about integrity by someone who's turned what used to be thoughtful political commentary into cheap ambush theater," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This isn't holding anyone accountable. This is bullying disguised as entertainment." But Colbert wasn't finished. In fact, her standing seemed to energize him further, as if her obvious distress was exactly the reaction he had been hoping to provoke. "Oh, so now I'm a bully? Because I asked you to explain positions that you've taken publicly? Because I didn't just let you use my platform as your personal soapbox, without any pushback whatsoever?" "You didn't ask me to explain my positions," Portman fired back, her voice now raised and carrying clearly throughout the studio. "You distorted them, attacked my character, questioned my heritage, and then acted like you were doing some kind of public service. This isn't journalism, Stephen. This is cruelty masquerading as courage." The use of his first name instead of the respectful distance she had maintained throughout the interview was like a slap across the face. Colbert's mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly underneath the television persona that his audience had never seen before. "Cruelty?" he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You want to talk about cruelty? How about the cruelty of using your privilege and platform to lecture people while living in a bubble of wealth and Hollywood connections? How about the cruelty of virtue signaling about causes you'll never personally experience while attacking the very country that gave your family refuge?" The accusation was so loaded with venom and historical manipulation that it took Portman's breath away. For a moment she simply stared at him, seemingly unable to believe that he had actually said what he had just said. The studio was now so quiet that individual audience members could be heard breathing. "How dare you?" Portman whispered, and those three words carried more power than if she had screamed them. "How dare you use my family's history as a weapon against me? How dare you turn their suffering into a talking point for your show?" Colbert leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, apparently pleased with the reaction he had finally managed to provoke. "I'm not using anything. I'm just pointing out the irony of someone who benefits from American freedom and opportunity, spending so much time criticizing American allies and values." "American values?" Portman's voice was rising to near shouting levels now, her composure completely abandoned. "Is this what American values look like? Ambushing guests, distorting their words, attacking their families, and then claiming moral superiority? Is this what you think good television looks like?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch that made everyone in the studio acutely uncomfortable. Camera operators were looking to their producers for guidance, unsure whether they should keep filming or cut away. The audience sat frozen, torn between fascination and horror at what they were witnessing unfold. "I think good television looks like holding celebrities accountable instead of giving them free publicity," Colbert shot back, his voice now matching hers in volume and intensity. I think it looks like asking hard questions instead of lobbing softballs. And I think it looks like not letting people hide behind their victim status when they're called out for their hypocrisy. That final word, hypocrisy, seemed to be the breaking point. Portman's face went completely white, then flushed red with an anger so pure and focused that it was almost frightening to witness. She took a step toward Colbert's desk, her hands clenched at her sides, and for a terrifying moment it looked like the confrontation might become physical. The silence stretched, for what felt like an eternity. Everyone in the studio held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Security personnel had quietly moved closer to the stage area, though they seemed as uncertain as everyone else about what exactly they were supposed to do in this unprecedented situation. Then Portman spoke, and her voice was so controlled, so deadly quiet, that it was somehow more terrifying than all the shouting that had come before. You know what, Stephen? You've shown everyone exactly who you really are tonight. Not the clever satirist, not the political commentator, not even the entertaining talk show host. You've shown them that underneath all that supposed wit and intelligence, you're just another bully who gets off on humiliating people for sport. She stepped back from his desk, her posture straightening as she seemed to gather herself for one final devastating blow. You want to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about a man who built his career on supposedly speaking truth to power, who now uses his platform to attack women who actually try to make a difference in the world. Let's talk about someone who hides behind comedy to avoid taking responsibility for his cruelty. Colbert's confident smirk was finally beginning to waver. Perhaps for the first time he was starting to realize that he had pushed too far, that this confrontation was spiraling completely out of his control. But his ego wouldn't let him back down now. Not in front of his audience, not on his own show. Oh, spare me the moral superiority lecture, he shot back, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. You're the one who came on my show expecting special treatment, expecting to be able to say whatever you wanted without any what? Portman interrupted, her voice rising again. Without any accountability? That's rich, coming from someone who just spent the last 20 minutes attacking my family, my heritage, my character, and my work, all while hiding behind the excuse that you're just asking tough questions. You're not a journalist, Stephen. You're a shock jock in an expensive suit. The insult hit its target perfectly. Colbert's face flushed with anger, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, he looked genuinely rattled. How dare you come on my show and— Your show? Portman's laugh was bitter and cutting. This isn't a show anymore. This is a public meltdown. This is you revealing that you're so desperate for ratings, so hungry for viral moments, that you're willing to destroy a guest's dignity just to get people talking. Well, congratulations, Stephen. Mission accomplished. She began unhooking her microphone with sharp, efficient movements, her hands steady despite the obvious fury coursing through her. You want to know what's really hypocritical? It's a man who claims to care about social justice while using his platform to tear down women who actually do the work. It's someone who pretends to be progressive while employing the same tactics as every other privileged man who can't stand being challenged by a woman. The microphone came free with a sharp pop that echoed through the studio speakers. Portman held it for a moment, looking directly into the camera with an expression of disgust and disappointment that seemed to pierce through the screen. To anyone watching this at home, she said, addressing the camera directly rather than Colbert. This is what toxic masculinity looks like when it's dressed up as entertainment. This is what happens when someone values their ego more than basic human decency. And this is exactly why so many women are afraid to speak up about important issues, because they know they'll be subjected to exactly this kind of treatment. She placed the microphone on Colbert's desk with deliberate care, the small sound somehow more final than if she had thrown it down in anger. I came here tonight to talk about women who are fighting for their lives in conflict zones around the world. Instead, I got ambushed by a man who thinks attacking his guests makes him look clever. I hope you're proud of yourself, Stephen. I hope this was worth it." Colbert sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to find words that could somehow salvage the situation. The studio audience was completely silent now, many of them looking ashamed to have witnessed what they had just seen. Even his bandleader, who had been with him for years, was staring at him with an expression of obvious disapproval. "Natalie, wait," Colbert finally managed, his voice smaller than it had been all evening. "Look, maybe we got a little heated, but—" "No!" Portman cut him off without even turning around. "There's no coming back from this. You made your choice. You decided that humiliating me was more important than having a real conversation about issues that matter. You decided that your ego was more valuable than basic respect." She was already walking toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor. The sound seemed to echo in the deadly quiet space, each step taking her further away from the wreckage of what had once been a professional interview. "You know what the saddest part is?" she called back over her shoulder, her voice carrying clearly through the studio. "You actually used to be better than this. You used to be someone who could challenge people's ideas without destroying their dignity. Tonight you showed everyone that version of you is gone." And with that, Natalie Portman walked off the Late Show stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a humiliated host, and a moment of television that would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered for years to come. The cameras kept rolling as Colbert sat alone at his desk, the silence stretching on, until finally someone in the control room mercifully cut to commercial. The damage was done. By morning, clips of the confrontation would be trending on every social media platform, with overwhelming public support for Portman and harsh criticism for Colbert's behavior. The incident would mark the beginning of a significant decline in his ratings and reputation, proving that even in the world of late-night television, there are some lines that should never be crossed.